obviously I'm doing cleats today. I did cleats some years ago, and John came in with my old handout and the cleat he had made. I'd almost forgotten about that. It was about 8 years ago. So anyway, what I did previously, I had 3 different ways to do it. Method A, B, and C, and I decided that C is really the best, so I ignored A and B. Make life easier for everybody, and if we had a cold day, I don't think we want to go through too much detail. So I'm going to talk about how I make cleats, and I don't feel like there's just one way to do it. It kind of also depends on the tools you have. I don't have a bandsaw, so I instead of a bandsaw, I use my pull saw for one of the cuts. A table saw is handy, bandsaw would be handy, and a draw knife or something like that would be handy. I didn't bring one because I'm not going to get into all the details today. But anyway, I'll just kind of walk you through the general process, and then most of your woodworkers at some level will just have to figure out how to make the cuts. I'll just give some suggestions. So in the handout, there's probably the most important thing is this page with the table of dimensions. And do we run it? Oh, okay. So there's 3 sizes. There's a 7, a 10, and a 14-inch long cleat. And you can see the section drawing and the plan drawing with all dimensions, and that's kind of where you start. So I've marked up a couple of these. This is the 10-inch and the 7, and so usually where I start is locating the 2 holes as they're circles. And that would be the holes on the sides, and that's sort of the most important, one of the most important dimensions, because that defines where your line is going to lie when you're using it. So you have to draw the profile, and then you need to also, on the top, you need to eventually locate 2 holes or 3 for mounting, and so I use some of the tools I use I use a circle template to mark the diameter holes, and for example in the 10-inch they indicate dimension E, so that's a 7/16 inch diameter hole, and there's no magic to that. The hole has to be just a little bit larger than your line size. So a 7/16 would be probably a 3/8 inch line. So they're typically just a little larger. You don't want your line to jam in that notch that you end up cutting out at the base of your cleat. So I usually drill it with a brad point. You could use Forster bit, whatever you have, but something maybe just a little better than a plain metal. You probably don't want to have it blow out on the edge, and it's really important that those be done accurately. So a drill press or some substitute to get your holes drilled perpendicular to your block. Again, that's the first thing you'll do is drill those all the way through. So kind of jumped ahead a little bit. Once you get the cleat made, you're going to want to fair all the sharp edges. You're going to have to do some by eye kind of fairing. Nothing much uglier than a sort of squarish cleat. And that's, I think, one of the nice things about this table is it will give you a fairly nice looking cleat, I think, if you follow it, and some of it again is by eye, but it does need to taper some. You don't want it to be just squared off, and They also obviously taper toward the ends, toward the horns. And there's also, you also want to have a bevel. You want your shoulders, cut at an angle. You can get all that from the drawing. So as far as wood, a list of different woods. These I've made are black locust, kind of my favorite cleat wood. You can get it, but if not, teak, probably not the first choice because of cost, but white oak is pretty good. You want things obviously the same kind of wood you use for building a boat, something that's very rot resistant. So black locust is good, white oak, maple and ash are also recommended. The important thing is the grain orientation. So you don't want obviously cross grain because when you put stress on it, it's going to fracture at the grain. So your grain wants to be oriented along the length of your cleat. Hopefully that's kind of obvious. And I haven't quite decided whether I like my grain horizontal or vertical. I'm not sure it'll make a lot of difference, but I suppose vertical is probably good for strength in the vertical direction. But I think most of what I ended up with is kind of a diagonal grain, and so far it seems to work pretty well. But just as long as it's oriented in the length. Fastening, I think if you're going to use a large cleat, you probably want to bolt it. I've never been, I think using screws doesn't make a lot of sense, particularly in the plywood. And you could either do a recessed, bolt, machine bolt, I guess, and put a plug in it, or you can use a carriage bolt. Now, some people might think carriage bolt's sort of primitive. I kind of think of it as working boat chic. I use carriage bolts. The thing I like about a carriage bolt is the way the head kind of covers your hole. If you bed under the head, you're not going to have to worry about water ever seeping down and rotting your plywood. But even with the carriage bolt, you still want to bed your cleat, and you also want to, if you're going through a plywood deck, you want to, as always recommended for any penetration through a deck, anything to be exposed to water, you want to epoxy that hole well. So a couple coats of epoxy to make sure that any moisture gets down will not go, sideways into your plywood. So, but a carriage bolt does give you a little extra protection, but it's not quite as, if you're building a yacht, I guess you probably want to recess it and put a plug in, whatever those guys call that. I suppose in a mast you're going to probably end up screwing it in. So I can't give you much advice about the size of the screws, but I guess you can just figure that one out. Here's a jam cleat, so this might be up on a mast perhaps. It's got one side that is sort of normal height, and the other side which is much smaller. So obviously when you run your line around it, it'll wedge on the narrow side. And I think the handout does have some information on making jam cleats. Let's see. Yeah, so anyway, going back to where I was about laying out, I put all the lines on. So we have the holes, center line, location for where I'm going to drill it, mount it, and then the lines for the horns, and then also on the ends, you want to. I put marks for where how it'll taper, and also the thickness of the horn. One thing that I think they mention, or if they don't mention it, it's important that you want to have a base that is so you want to have perpendicular sides up to where the holes are, and then you taper. So when you cut your taper, it's important when you set the height of your table saw blade that you don't have it cut all the way into what would be the bottom. Otherwise, your entire cleat will be tapered, and it's not a reason to throw it away, but it just kind of it ruins the aesthetics a little bit. You really want to have kind of a perpendicular base before you start your taper. So yeah.
Could you pass that marked up line?
Yeah, okay. We've got two sizes that are marked up, so I'll pass one in each direction.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was thinking I was going to do that, but I forgot, so thanks, man. So as I said, again, I'll reiterate, the first step is to drill the holes. And no matter what method you're going to use, you drill the holes. So the second step, that's where it's a little bit, you have to kind of decide what tools you're going to use. So what I usually do, because of what I have, is I cut the shoulders next. So that's where you use a bevel gauge. If you've marked it up with all the dimensions, you've got your you'll end up with your beveling angle. You can take off from your block. So you just set your bevel gauge to match that angle. And then you go over to your table saw, tilt the blade to that angle, and cut both sides. So you can kind of imagine this is still a block. It's very easy, therefore, to run it through in both directions. You're going to run it through upside down, and then you're going to set the height of your blade so that it only comes up to where you want your shoulder to be, right? So your blade will come up just that high, right? And don't raise it anymore, or you'll end up tapering your base as well. So you run it through in both directions. Takes care of the shoulders, also wipes out a lot of your lines, just as Mitch was saying last week, or last time. So you have to go back and put some lines back in it. But it's really easy because you've got your ends still marked, and you know where you've got your hole. And all you're gonna do is just connect the line between the tangent of the hole and the thickness of the horn. Draw those lines in, and now you're ready to cut away this part. So this was, if you imagine that, I set this just like this with already. I had the sides cut. I just put it in a wood vise, and so. Again, if you don't have a bandsaw, but you do have you're really good with a handsaw, you can cut these by hand, which is what I always do. So you have your two lines, and you just line up your two lines really carefully, and just very carefully saw until you get to the hole, and then you have another cut on the bottom here. You cut that until you get into the hole, and then you remove this piece. Okay. So, and then you do the same thing on the other side. And if you're pretty precise, you'll get it close enough. Doesn't have to be perfect. That's why we got a wood rasp to clean up the messy part. I suppose you could do this with a bandsaw, even after you cut the shoulders off. I've never tried it, since I don't have a bandsaw. But I guess you could put it up against the fence and.
You take the shoulders back on.
Huh?
You take the shoulders back on. This is what I do when I put it in.
Say again? Yeah,
You put
take
the
the
shoulders back on.
Yeah, you could do it. You could do that. Yeah. I mean, this is where the shared knowledge of everybody's tricks comes out. So yeah, you could put the shoulders on. That would probably get you almost perpendicular. You could build a little jig. Also, I suppose if you press it up against a fence, you only go into the hole, so no danger cutting your fingers off, and then you flip it over and you do the other side. So I guess you could do that. So there's a couple ways around the problem. So, but eventually you get both of them cut off. decided to leave one on just so you can see what it looks like with it cut off. And then, so once you've got all those two cuts made, then probably the next thing to do would be to work on making the top concave. And all they give you in the dimensions chart is a dimension H. So it's an H for a 10-inch, says it's a 1/4 inch. So what you're trying to do is at the very center, you want to come down 1/4 inch, and the rest of it is kind of up to you what it looks like. So that's where if you have a French curve, which I don't know how many people have French curves anymore, but I've never heard of it, but if you ever did any drafting in high school or something, you may have heard of it. But anyway, they have different ones, and you want one with a fairly gradual curve, or you could whip up something by hand or whatever, take it off of a large, somewhat curved, or I suppose you could get a spline and kind of make it a curve that's pleasing. Anyway, you just want 1/4 inch depth, and I drew it up with a French curve and just marked it out, and then I just went at it with a draw knife. And again, as Mitch said in the last session, you got to pay attention to your grain. You don't want to have a big rip out, so more than likely you're going to be rotating it from somewhere along the length. You're going to have a grain change. So, but anyway, you just keep working on it, and probably I mark a line on both sides so that I can work down to the line on both sides, and eventually you get there. It's not quite finished, but the ones that are finished.
Well, for people who do have a bandsaw, the ideal way to make those cuts that you're talking about, since you've already drilled the holes for your screws,
Yeah.
screw it to a 2x4.
Yeah.
So that it's held flat.
Yeah.
And then use the 2x4 as your cutting sled.
Yet another good idea. Right, so we've solved that problem. We have at least three ways to solve the bandsaw problem, as long as you have a bandsaw. If not, Japanese pull saw. Okay, so we talked about cutting the concave part on the top, and then after that, it's just hand finishing. So a good rasp to kind of work everything smooth, and the taper. You may want a little more taper. You definitely want to round your horns. And then also you need a round rasp to work in your line's going to be lead. Smooth those out, make them nice and round. And there may be a little bit of a transition area that needs to be smoothed out. I didn't quite finish this one, but I guess set around. Right, talked about that. Yeah, you can obviously wait till the end to drill the holes for mounting, and they recommend just sanding it smooth, nice and smooth, so it doesn't abrade your line. And then you need some sort of finish. Some people say don't bother painting it, which is probably true. I can't imagine why you want to paint a cleat. You could varnish it. The varnish may wear off quickly where the line runs, but whatever. And you can also, the easy way is to oil it. I typically just use some oiled linseed oil, a couple coats, and then depending on where your boat's kept, you probably have to re-oil it every year or twice a year or whatever. And right, I think in the handout it also it shows the jam cleat. It shows something called a rigging cleat. So if you need something attached to your shroud, a slight modification of design, you would attach your rigging cleat with some lashing, some whipping. I think that's about it. Any questions?
One other thing, it might be fairly obvious, but if you're putting a cleat on a mast or a boom or whatever, we're building sailboats, so there's going to be a lot of those. The easiest way to get a nice fit is wrap the thing in sandpaper and then
Match the curvature.
Just after you finish your cleat, sand the flat base, to match this part you're gonna run on.
You're right. Another thing that I saw in one of the handouts was they talk about the mounting, the orientation, that it's typically not mounted, it may not be mounted parallel to your water line. It may want to have a slight angle depending on where it goes, so I guess it helps it to lay better. They talked about a 10-degree orientation. I couldn't quite follow what they're talking about, but I guess if I was building a boat, I would at least pay a little attention to whether you want it to be parallel to the water line or at some angle, so there is some consideration there. I also have some, I brought some extra blocks, so if anybody wants to take a block, they're for the taking today. Get them out of my garage and.
In your hard garage?
Would you like the 10-second bosun's mate explanation of
Yeah.
line angle?
Go for it.
So, you're always going to bring your cleat, your line around the back side of the cleat first. And then you're going to go over the top and, all of that. But first thing you do is come around the back. And then you go around, you make a round, you turn around the front as well. Now, if your line's coming in like this, it's real easy. If your cleat's sitting like that and you want to come down this side of it, your line's right up against it, makes a mess. So when you think about where your line's going to be coming from, 10 degrees is good angle. But that's why the angle, when you're installing a cleat, you always want to think about where the line's coming from and leave room to get around the other end.
Cool.
I like black locust. I think you can get it here. I think my second choice would probably be white oak because it's rot resistant. I think you want something strong and rot resistant to me, and not too expensive. Money was no object, and maybe teak.
Where do you find the black locust?
Well, there was a guy who specialized in black locust, and I guess I looked it up online and found him, and he's somewhere outside of Portland. It was kind of funny. I met him in Selwood. It was kind of like we're doing a drug deal.
Black
You
locust.
want black locust? Trunk. Took an hour's fall. It was pretty cheap.
1 o'clock in the morning.
That was actually about 2 in the afternoon.
If you have a neighbor that has one of those in your yard, you can do two things with one chainsaw. You can get rid of those nasty pea pods that drop all over your yard,
Yeah.
and you get to some wood.
Yeah.
Just make sure that
Actually,
Chad?
Jim Liddy made the stand on his.
How would black walnut be? Because I've got a bunch of little pieces of black
Steve
walnut.
Mahoney used to have quite a bit of it.
Really?
I don't know. I think you just want to check on rot resistance. See if it's rot
Walnut
resistant.
has high rot resistance.
Black walnut?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would look nice too.
Yeah.
Real nice.
Yeah, I watched the grain.
Watch the grading. Yeah.
I used to get my black locust from Steve Mahoney, because he had a lot of it.
Who was it?
Steve Mahoney.
Okay. Yeah.
He had hardwood, he'd give me pieces and I would
Yeah.
make,
Okay.
I would cut off those those for tool handles.
Yeah.
And during my last move, somehow they got on the truck and didn't get back off again.
I always had this impression that black locust was hard to work. It's hard, blah blah. There was no problem at all. It cuts great on your table saw. It cuts great by hand. I wouldn't worry about it at all. Even when it's dry, it cuts well. No problem. Anything else?
Yeah. It seems to me there's a lot of similarity between making cleats and making oarlock blocks. Have you made oarlock blocks?
I haven't.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
what I've been doing.
similar,
But
yeah.
the process is really the same. You're working with small things.
Yeah.
You're shaping. You're
Yeah.
tapering. Yeah. You're concerned with aesthetics and strength and fastening.
I think once you have the basic skills, hand working skills, you pretty much make everything on the boat, right?
Okay.
Mast. I mean, I was thinking mast-wise or some similarity.
Yeah.
Yeah, just learn all those skills. Way you go.
One other thing about finishing, Ralph, just the difference between if you're making a mooring cleat, varnishing is fine. If you're making a sailboat, I highly recommend oiling simply because you want to be able to ease a line with some friction. And a varnish cleat doesn't give you that same control. You just oil the cleat, one thing, you're gonna wear the varnish off if you're sawing a line around the cleat. But also, it's much easier to handle a line with fewer turns on it if you have a little bit of friction on the cleat.
Yeah, I mean, the annual maintenance is pretty low. It's not as low as bronze, but it's low enough. It's not a
Easier to make.
little sandpaper and a oil and a can of oil and a rag, and you're good for another year. All right, well, if you want blocks, and then
Thanks,
everybody
Ralph.
get a handout.
Thank you, Ralph. Very good.
Russ, so if anybody else needs, I have extra charts. Okay,